Welcome back, everybody, to day 2. We had Why Wars Start, and today we will have Why Wars End, with a bit of How Wars End as well. I put my contact information here, my email, which I didn't have in the previous slides, in case you want to send me an email. If you have any questions about the talks or any comments you want to make, you can contact me there. So, outline for today, we'll talk a little bit about what war is, at least thought of in the theoretical sense that we're going to think about it here. Then how wars end, and I'll present a little bit of data on how wars end, or how wars have ended in the past 70-odd years, with victory, armistice, and peace treaty being 3 prominent ways that they could end. And then we'll get into the meat of it and talk about why wars end. Focusing on the same causes of war that we looked at last time, namely private information, uncertainty. We'll see how domestic politics feeds into that. Changing relative power, what can be done in the context of changing relative power, and commitment and trust issues. This picture may not be famous in Ukraine. This famous picture in the United States. It was taken when Japan surrendered in World War II, so it's the end of the war for the United States, and it's this couple kissing in Times Square in New York. So this is the hoped-for moment, although it's funny, I looked at this is sort of a symbol of joy and spontaneous happiness at the end of the war, but now if you think about it through feminist lenses, you start thinking, well, did she want to be kissed? Did she consent to this or not? It has multiple meanings now, perhaps. But anyway, assuming she wanted to be kissed, we can think of this as the happy ending, and we can think of whether we will see the happy ending here. In terms of the front line, just to sort of reinforce where we are now. This map is generated by this American group, the Institute for the Study of War. I don't know if you guys have followed their website, ISW, in Washington. And they produce daily maps of the front line in Ukraine. And you can zoom right down into like very small scale and see the details. So it's extremely helpful. I zoomed out here so that you would see the whole map of Ukraine. But you can zoom in on any sector of the front and see really what's going on in detail. For instance, this is the site of the offensive that's been going on this summer and into the fall that everyone's been focusing on. And over in the Bakhmut is like somewhere around here, I think, and that's been a prominent battlefield as well. So in the black outline are the territories that were held by Russia prior to the recent invasion in February of 2022. And in outlined in red are areas held by Russia today. So you can see how much territory has been taken. So what is war? How do we think of war conceptually? War is many things, of course, and different things to different people. And it's important not to lose sight of the fact of its costs, of its horrors for the people enduring it. But when we're thinking of war from a theoretical perspective, we also have to use some abstract thought, abstract reasoning to conceive of it, to try to understand it in strategic terms. And so it's typically thought of as a 2-round process where the rounds can be repeated over time in the kind of literature that I come from. So each round you have 2 portions, the fighting portion and the bargaining portion. And in the fighting portion, you either win or you lose. One side can win. If one side wins, then the other side loses. And vice versa, if the other side wins. If you have 2 players, player 1, player 2, one side wins, the other side loses, or vice versa. And the important thing about winning and losing in this context is that if you lose, that's it. You're done. The war is over. You are no longer able to contest the issue at stake. Involved in wars, I'll kind of reinforce in the next slide, there is a possibility of being disarmed, a possibility of simply no longer being able to fight, even if you wanted to. And so that's what we think of as winning or losing. If you win, the other side can no longer fight back. If you lose, you can no longer fight back. And there's also a cost of fighting imposed by the fighting. There's the death and destruction involved in warfare. Somewhat new in a sense to this perspective is the second part of the round, which is the idea that with each period in a war, however you want to conceive of the period, it could be a year, it could be months, it could be half a year, it could be essentially every day, there is at least implicitly an opportunity to bargain with the other side. And you're not always bargaining in the literal sense of sitting across the table and talking and exchanging proposals. But you are implicitly, at least, able to bargain if you want to. And if you're not bargaining, that's because of a choice to not bargain. And so, even though you may not be physically negotiating in the usual sense of face-to-face negotiations or exchanging messages, you are, in a sense, confronted with the opportunity to communicate with the other side, if you wanted to, about the settlement of the issue. And in particular, the two sides could, at a minimum, agree to stop fighting, which is sometimes called an armistice if it's formalized. Sometimes it just stops, and the two sides never even talk about it. They just stop fighting. So they could agree to stop fighting. Sort of more ambitiously, they could agree on a peace deal to end the war and resolve the issue in dispute. Or they could do neither of those things. And oftentimes, like if you're thinking of the rounds as every month that goes by or something, the default is to do neither of those things and just go on to the next round and keep fighting. But at least the opportunity is there, and it's important to realize that and to conceptually understand that and think about that. That at every moment you could end the war if you wanted to. And if you don't, it's because you've made at least an implicit choice not to do so. So you have fighting and you have bargaining, or at least the opportunity to bargain. And if nobody wins, and if the two sides don't agree to stop fighting, then you proceed to the next round. And you have another round of fighting and another round of bargaining. And again, if nobody wins, and if the two sides don't agree to stop fighting, you have another round. Until one of the possible endings of the war happens, right? And I put the round dots signify the endings of the war, the possible endings. Either one wins, two wins, or they agree to stop fighting. Once one of those three things happens, the war is done. Now, there's a couple of terms that I want to kind of reinforce that I'll be using from time to time as time goes by. Number one is decisive war. So the thing about war that, there's different types of war, I would say. And some wars are at least potentially decisive. And what do I mean by decisive? I mean decisive in the sense that one side can win, the other side could lose. Again, in this hard sense that the loser can no longer contest the issue in dispute. They just physically lack the ability to fight. So in World War II, for instance, the German regime in 1945 loses the ability to continue to fight. Hitler's dead in his bunker, the command structure is destroyed, the German troops are killed or disarmed or surrendered. Whatever is left of the German government simply lacked any military capability anymore. So the war is over. Even if they wanted to continue fighting, they really couldn't do it. Same for the American Civil War. Once the Union troops have basically crushed the Confederacy, there's nothing they can do, right? They can want to fight back, but they can't. They can't really contest it. Now you might say that, well, they can always keep fighting in some way. They can engage in terrorism, they can engage in very low-level strikes, covert action, something like that. But in terms of large-scale conventional war, you can actually be defeated, and then you can't fight back. So that's a decisive war. But some wars are not very decisive, or they lack that decisive quality. And so a war of attrition is a war in which the chance that either side wins, that you have this decisive outcome, where one side wins and the other side loses, is low, right? Small or perhaps even zero. And yet, so what's left of war? What's left is imposing costs. So terrorism falls into this category. Right? When Al-Qaeda struck the Twin Towers in New York in 2001, there was no way that Al-Qaeda is going to win the war with the United States in the sense of disarm the United States so the United States can no longer fight back against it, right? That's impossible. The chance is zero. That's not the strategy. The strategy is to impose costs on the United States and to tell them, look, you're doing these things we don't like, you're intervening in the Middle East, you're supporting Israel, we want you to stop all those things. We can't defeat you in the classical military decisive sense, but we can impose costs on you. We can impose costs that are so great that you will decide eventually that it's not worth doing the things we don't want you to do. So that's a war of attrition. And many wars bog down into wars of attrition, where the chance of winning and losing is relatively small, but you continue to impose costs upon the other side, and it becomes a contest in who's willing to absorb costs for longer. So in that case, the parties need to agree to stop fighting in order to end the war. Now, there are some wars of attrition that sort of blend the two categories that I'm talking about. You can have a war of attrition which is eventually decisive, although it takes a long time. And some people argue that World War I was like this. The present war may be in some ways like this, in the sense that the battles that are happening as the war goes on are relatively unlikely to be decisive, but eventually somebody's going to run out of material to fight with. They're going to run out of troops, they're going to run out of guns, run out of ammunition, run out of money. And once they run out of those things, they can no longer fight in the decisive sense, right? They are simply not capable of fighting anymore. So you could have a war of attrition that is sort of a blend that becomes decisive eventually. But you could, it's important to realize, I think, have wars of attrition, and many cases are of this kind, where it's never decisive in that way. The war could go on indefinitely for years and years and years, decades, right? The United States was in Afghanistan for 20 years. And we eventually left. But we didn't leave because we couldn't physically fight anymore. We left because we decided not to fight, because we decided we simply weren't going to achieve our aims there, having tried for 20 years and failed, and so we decided to get out. So we made a choice to end that war on losing terms, but it wasn't because we were physically incapable of fighting. So it's important to bear those things in mind. What you want, of course, if you're fighting a war, is to win, to vanquish the other side, to render them incapable of offering further resistance, and that way you get to impose the peace deal that you wish. But many wars end short of that through some sort of attrition process or before that final victory has been achieved, and there's some sort of at least implicit negotiation. Okay, stalemates are wars of attrition that have settled into a kind of stasis. They've gone on for a while, and they don't seem like they're going to end anytime soon. So we call that a stalemate, right? Nobody has any great ideas or innovations for decisive victories, war-winning offensives. It's just a contest in the imposition of costs, and neither side is clearly unable to bear those burdens, and so the war is just dragging on and on. There's a term coined by Bill Zartman in the context of civil wars, the hurting stalemate. Hurting stalemates are stalemates that are going on for a long time, but considered to be quite costly by the actors involved, and so they have an extra incentive to want to end it. In fact, Zartman's concept was when you have a hurting stalemate, that's when you're likely to have war termination. The war is likely to end when you have a stalemate. Neither side thinks they can win on the battlefield. It's just imposing costs on each other, and it's become painful, and so everybody has an incentive to end the war. So these are some key concepts. Okay, so how do conflicts end? And here I'm referencing an article by Joachim Kreutz in 2010, introducing a new data set. The field of international relations has lots of data sets on conflict. The people at the UCDP in Sweden are basically the Scandinavians. The Norwegians and the Swedes are really pushing the development of data sets and quantitative analyses of international relations. And this is presenting the data set from one of these efforts. Anyway, so Kreutz examines 3 types of war from 1946 to 2005: interstate wars, wars between different countries; intrastate wars, or civil wars within a country; and extra-systemic wars, which are basically a kind of a holdover category from the old days. They're imperial wars between, like, France and an African colony or something like that. Not so many of those in the post-war period, except for the wars of independence. Very few of them anymore, anyway. And he codes 4 categories of conflict ending: victory, decisive outcomes on the battlefield; a peace agreement; a ceasefire; and a catch-all category of other, which is basically they just stop fighting, and they don't really talk about it. They just stop. And here is a little histogram of how wars end. So the extra-systemic ones, these are the imperial wars. There's not that many of them, and relatively few end in ceasefires, as we can see. Lots of others, a bunch of peace agreements. Typically, when the colonial state decided to get out, they signed an agreement with the successor government. This is the category we're most interested in. These are the interstate wars, the international wars, and we see that peace agreements are less frequent than ceasefires that don't have peace agreements, about half as many. Victory is about the same number as the peace agreements, and other wars that just sort of end somehow is the most frequent category. So looking at that, we see interstate wars, perhaps the most frequent way that they end is some sort of petering out, or just quitting to fight, or some sort of ceasefire where they acknowledge that that's what they're doing, but don't take it further and have a peace agreement. Neither does either side win. These are the interstate wars here, the civil wars. And that's an interesting category because here we see quite a different pattern. First of all, there's many, many more of them in this post-World War II period. And if you look at the 90s, that's where it really starts exploding. There's even more then. But we see that victory is common in civil wars. Typically, you have the government side crushing the rebels. Occasionally, you have the rebels overthrowing the government. And you have a lot of others in there too, where basically the rebels just give up and stop fighting. That's a very common outcome in civil wars. But you have some peace treaties, and increasingly in the 90s, you would see this category zooming up. After the Cold War, international institutions and the United States and other countries were basically pressuring Civil War participants to sign peace deals and have peacekeepers and international aid and reestablishment of peace. So this category shot up in the 90s. And ceasefires are also still common. So in terms of the data, you can see something here about the relative frequency of these types of wars. Here is war duration for the 3 different categories and broken out by how they end. We see the civil wars and the extra-systemic wars can last quite a long time. This is in days. The interstate wars, international wars, tend to be shorter. If you look at the numbers here, this level is 500 days. And so we're a little bit over 500 days now in the Ukrainian war. So hopefully that bodes well for it ending soon, but of course these are just averages. And we notice nothing too remarkable about how long the wars last in terms of the different categories, except in the extra-systemic imperial wars. The victories tend to be short. Victories tend to be short in the civil wars here. So if one side's going to win, they're going to win quickly. If it's going to be a negotiated settlement, that's probably going to happen after a long war. Yes?
Yes, but can you remind the difference between the middle one and on the right?
So this category versus this category?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the international wars between states. This is Russia versus Ukraine. These are the civil wars. So this is like the Contras versus the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Or this is like Yeah, Yugoslavia, the Croats versus the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So these are civil wars, those are international wars. Civil wars, much longer than international wars, although victories, again, take less time. Okay, so those are just a couple of data slides, yes? Other, so other includes basically wars that just sort of stop in not obviously visible ways, like people just stop fighting for one reason or other. Ceasefires are agreements to have a ceasefire. So like a ceasefire is often an agreement between two sides that will say, we're all going to stop fighting at a certain date on a certain time. And also regulate things like where exactly the front line is going to be. Are we going to have some like pullback from the line of contact? Are there going to be peacekeepers going in there? So a ceasefire is a more developed agreement along those lines. Exactly, not developed enough to be a peace treaty. A peace treaty, in addition to a ceasefire or an armistice, would say, and the final territorial resolution between us is going to be here. The new border will be such and such. And by 2 years after, we will have exchanged embassies and like all kinds of different additional factors. Yes?
Why don't you consider the Russian-Ukrainian war as an extra post-Cold?
That's an interesting definitional question. I don't know, you could probably make the case, although I would say that Ukraine, having been independent for 30 years, counts as a sovereign, independent UN member, and so it's not like India breaking away from Great Britain or Vietnam breaking away from France. Those are wars where the metropolitan power is actually physically there in control of the colony and is being kicked out through revolutionary war, usually. Algeria with France would be another example. Did you have another?
Just want to add the case of the French war with Vietnam in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about. Angola would be in there, right? Although Angola, the Portuguese didn't really fight. But yeah, France, Algeria, France, Vietnam. There were some of these wars, excuse me, in the 30s as well. Britain in Kenya, the Mau Mau insurgency. Britain versus Malaysia, the Malay uprising. Britain versus USA, absolutely. Extra systemic. The data set doesn't go back that far. Excuse me. Any other questions on the data? Okay. Yes.
Maybe we can make a shortcut to the further discussion we're going to have, but we can see that the amount of victories in interstate, not the amount, it's the duration, excuse me. When there is a victory in the Civil War, the duration is far lower than in both of the scenarios. Will you expound this later, or you can provide the hypothesis now?
I don't talk a lot. Excuse me. I'm not sure I'll talk about that particular question a lot. I would just say, typically, victories can happen early on. Like a typical pattern, I think, in the data, although I don't really have a good citation for this, but my sense is a typical pattern in the data is the two sides fight, and sometimes one side wins relatively quickly. And that's why you have these short wars. And then if that doesn't happen, they fight for a while. And then some of them had a victory after a long time. So like the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, right? The Tamil Tigers emerge, they fight successfully against the Tamil state, they establish a truce, and they last for a while. And then eventually the government gets its act together and comes back and crushes them. So that's a delayed victory. But in many cases, after the delay, you have negotiations and some sort of deal, or you have a delay, like a long, indecisive war, and eventually they stop fighting.
By victory, we consider every single scenario in which a losing signs surrender. Am I correct?
Kind of depends. I'm thinking of it more as, again, this sort of decisive war outcome where you're really, the losing side isn't really able to fight anymore. If you're signing an agreement, it implies that your consent is still required. So for instance, when in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, we didn't sign any agreement with Saddam Hussein signifying that he lost the war. We just overthrew his government and hunted him down and then handed him over to his political enemies who killed him.
Yes.
So in that case, there's no agreement with the losing power. Interestingly, well, I'll get to another point related to that in a couple of slides, but yeah, that's my distinction. Okay. All right. So let's think about victory. Now, I am not actually a military strategist, but I read up on this literature and follow it to some extent anyway. So I will give you a rough outline of some aspects of military strategy that are important and suggest some further readings if you want to keep going. Excuse me. So here's a picture of a trench in World War I. World War I is a war that many people analogize the present war to and look back to for insight in the current fighting. So the problem by World War I already, over 100 years ago, was that modern weapons had become so lethal and so good at killing people that the battlefield had become an extremely dangerous place. So in comparison with the old days in the 19th century and the Napoleonic Wars, it started to change by the 1860s, the American Civil War and the Crimean War, but really decisively it changed in the late 19th century. But in the early days, like the American Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, you would have your troops massed in formations, marching in step, loading their rifles or their muskets all together at the same time, firing volleys at the enemy, all under tight control in regimented formations. And you would confront each other in long lines and fire at each other until one side broke and ran. But with modern weapons, you simply can't do that, right? They would all be dead at the end of the first minute or two of fighting. And indeed, if you have troops lying down with some shelter, some protection, with machine guns, you simply can't charge them with any prospect of success anymore if there's enough of them. It's just not possible. It's completely suicidal. So weapons, the repeating rifles and machine guns and artillery had become so lethal that massed troops in the open were fatally vulnerable. They were going to be annihilated if they tried to attack the other side. So how do you win wars under such conditions? How do you fight? And there's sort of two broad answers. Excuse me. One is attrition, which is that you try to just kill more of the enemy than you lose yourself. It's basically a war where it's just mass slaughter. And the hope is that you're willing to die or, you're able to kill slightly more than the enemy is able to kill of you. And at the end of the day, somebody is either going to run out of men or run out of money to pay for the equipment, et cetera. So it's a war of attrition. And many of the battles in World War I were like wars of attrition, as we'll tell you about in a second. But there's a better answer, which goes under a variety of different headings. I'll just call it maneuver here. But the concept here is you break through the enemy lines in a difficult, bloody battle. But once you're through the enemy lines, then you go past them into the rear area behind the front lines, and then you're in open country. You're no longer facing heavily defended terrain by the enemy. You're in open country, and you can maneuver, and you can go up behind the enemy lines and cut them off from their sources of supply, and thereby win the war without having to actually fight the majority of the enemy forces. And if you know your World War II history, you'll see these maps of what happened on the Eastern Front, where the Nazis in 1941 would punch through the Soviet lines, encircle huge numbers of Soviet troops, and basically starve them into submission. They would have to surrender because they were out of fuel, they were out of ammunition, they were not able to to fight effectively. So that's the better answer. Some sort of maneuver, some sort of breakthrough battles, followed up by exploitation. So on the Western Front in World War I, you saw these stalemates, right? These battles which were battles of attrition. Essentially, there's a trench system from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border throughout northern France and western Belgium. Many, many attempts to break through the lines and get to the rear areas where you could execute this sort of strategy. But they all failed. So at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British tried to break through the German lines. The Somme is an area in Belgium near the Channel. The British prepared a huge breakthrough battle, which they thought was potentially war-winning. They had tanks. The British were actually the innovator with tanks in World War I. They had tanks as early as 1916. They prepared for the assault by having a huge artillery barrage that went on for days and days, because they were trying to flatten and destroy the enemy trenches so that when the British troops charged at them, the machine guns would no longer be there. All of that failed, and in the initial day of the assault, the British took 60,000 casualties, 20,000 fatalities in one day of fighting, for essentially no significant territorial gains. So the thing was a colossal failure. At Verdun, the Germans tried to attack a heavily fortified French area, system of fortifications at Verdun. And the explicit goal was, we know we're probably not going to break through. We know this is not going to be a war-winning battle, but we're just going to kill more French than they kill of us. And eventually, since there's more Germans than French, the French will have to give in. It failed, of course. The British tried again in 1917 at Passchendaele, and this is the picture of the battlefield there. It rained and turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. It became absolutely impossible to advance, and tens of thousands were killed. So what was the problem with these strategies and the tactics that they're using? Number one, they would announce the presence, or they would announce the location of the intended offensive with a long artillery barrage, in some cases lasting weeks. So they would hit the enemy trenches opposite where they were going to attack day after day after day with artillery. But that provided crucial information for the Germans. And what it enabled the Germans to do is bring all of their reserves from other sectors of the front right behind the intended attack zone of the Allies. And so when the Allies came out of their trenches and rushed forward, there were fresh reserves waiting right behind the enemy lines for them. Second, the infantry was still advancing in the open, standing up, running at the enemy forces. And that proved still fatal. Even after a weeks-long artillery barrage, they were still able to, once the barrage was over, move material back to the front, set up machine gun posts, and mow down the enemy forces. So advancing in the open, again, completely futile. And the tanks that they had, which was everyone's great hope, here we have armored protection to go through the killing zone of the trenches. They proved too unreliable to do the job. They broke down, and so they were not successful. But this problem was actually solved in 1918, and it was solved by the Germans. And the solution had nothing to do with tanks, and it had nothing to do with aircraft. And I think this is an interesting lesson for the Ukrainian war currently, because there's a lot of discussion about F-16s and what the war would look like if Ukraine had F-16s, and is the delay in providing F-16s a crucial factor in affecting how the war is turning out. And here I'm relying on a scholar, a US scholar of war named Stephen Biddle, and you can read his book called Military Power, which is a very, very good book. So The solution that the Germans came up with in 1918 is what Steve Biddle calls the modern system. And the modern system goes like this. You have tight coordination between artillery and infantry, but you forget about the long, days-long, weeks-long artillery barrage that tells the enemy where exactly you're going to attack and gives them plenty of time to move their reserves to meet you. Instead, the opening artillery barrage is a couple of hours on the morning of the assault. You know, from dawn when you can first see until 11 o'clock in the morning, no later. Why? Because then you've still got surprise. And the purpose of the barrage is not to kill the enemy. It's not even to destroy the trench system, because you know with such a short barrage you can't actually achieve those goals. The purpose of it is to keep their heads down and to disrupt them, so that when your forces start attacking, they are still afraid to come up because they're worried about artillery barrage. And to the extent that you can, you have tight communications between the advancing artillery, the advancing infantry, and the artillery units about when to stop shooting. Right? You want them to stop shooting when your forces approach the enemy lines, because then you don't want them to shoot your own forces. Second, and most important, you have small, well-trained units. You don't have just a huge line of attackers hearing the whistle blow, getting up out of the trenches, and running to the enemy. That's a recipe for slaughter. You have small, well-trained units of 10, 15 people at most. They have different weapons. They have grenades. They have portable mortars. They have light machine guns and normal rifles. And they advance using this technique called fire and using cover and concealment, using covering fire. So you have, instead of having the whistle blow, everybody gets up and runs towards the enemy lines. When the whistle blows, a small fraction of people get up, and they don't go all the way to the enemy trenches. They go to the first cover they can find, which could be a shell hole, could be some little fold in the ground, anything that will conceal them from the enemy. Meanwhile, the people still in the trenches are firing at the enemy to keep their heads down and prevent them from firing at the people who are advancing. And then the people who advanced put their rifles on the horizon and start firing at the enemy to keep their heads down. And the people who are behind come up themselves, and they leapfrog like that, searching at every moment for cover and concealment, little holes in the ground, little humps and hollows, anything they can hide behind, anything that will offer them shelter from the enemy's sight and fire. And the key insight here is that no ground is perfectly flat. The ground is always at least slightly humped and hollowed, especially after there's been an artillery barrage and there's all kinds of shell holes to hide in. And that's what you take advantage of. So it's slower, you're not running at the enemy, it's a step-by-step process, but it works. And so at the end of a couple of hours, you've actually made progress with your forces, and most of them are still alive. And so it's much more effective than what happened in the previous offensives. And so what happens is the Germans implement this in 1918 and make enormous advances by World War I standards. Here's the front line, again from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. And you can see how it sort of snakes through northern France and up into Belgium. These areas were conquered by the Germans in the spring offensives of 1918. And like the other offensives of the previous years would barely move that line by a visible amount at all at this scale. So this is a huge advance. And actually, if you notice, it may be hard to read, but this is actually Paris right here. So the Germans are basically halfway to Paris again, which is where they were in 1914. So this was a very successful offensive by World War I standards. So this set of infantry tactics and infantry artillery coordination was perfected by the Germans in 1918 and has become the standard training for armies ever since. The problem is that not all armies are equally good at doing it. And so it can be an important distinction in terms of which countries can actually use effective military force. Now there are subsequent refinements and developments of that. You may have heard a lot about combined arms. The sort of US NATO way of war is kind of like this, was very much like this at the infantry level if necessary. But typically the United States is not fighting against a peer competitor and not fighting against heavily entrenched forces. And so we don't have to use these tactics. Instead, we can use all of our advances, all of our sort of advantages in technology, like vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, aircraft, artillery, and fight a much faster war. So we're hitting targets on the fly, we're moving forces constantly, and that's why the United States wins wars incredibly quickly against countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, at the beginning anyway. But we tend to lose when we ended up fighting a war of attrition against irregular forces. So the combined arms is a different, more advanced way of fighting, and there was a lot of debate, let's say, in the public sphere about the training that the Ukrainian forces got from NATO trainers in preparation for their offensive of this year, and whether that training was appropriate, given that the Ukrainians didn't have all of the advantages of the American forces, especially the air power and a lot of the other sort of advanced technology. And so training them in the American tactics doesn't necessarily lead to success if you don't have the American tools to do it, hence the criticism about the F-16s, et cetera. And I think there's some justice to those critiques. However, I think it's important to point out, again, the Germans mastered this in 1918. And they had they had aircraft, but they were not that important to the ultimate outcome. They had no tanks at all. So this was a purely infantry and artillery way of winning this war, of exactly the same kind of war that the Ukrainians are fighting now. So I think there are lessons to be learned there. And Steve Biddle has actually written some things about the current war and the roles of advanced technology versus the old school tactics. So well worth checking out. Okay, so if you want to know how to win this war, read Steve Biddle's book, is my brief advice. Okay, armistice. Some wars end with an agreement to stop fighting, but no peace treaty. And the more formal way, like you could just stop fighting, or you could have an agreement to stop fighting that resolves a few issues, like where exactly the border is going to go and what it's going to look like. And so in the Korean War, you have an armistice. And the Korean War, I think, is an interesting analogy here for the current war for a variety of reasons, having to do with how the war is fought and how it may end. So in 1950 through 53, North Korea and South Korea fought. The United States and the United Nations helped South Korea. China and the Soviet Union supported North Korea. All of the action in the war happened in the first year, in 1950. The North Koreans attacked from the north, pushed the South Koreans down to this area around Busan. Then MacArthur, the American general, launched an amphibious assault up to Incheon up here, started cutting across the peninsula. That caused the North Korean position to collapse because their supply lines were being cut. So they had to retreat. Then the Americans decided, hey, let's liberate North Korea, right? We're on a roll, let's go. So we started driving north to try to liberate all of North Korea. But of course, the Chinese were not happy about that. So the Chinese then came down and pushed the American forces back down to the middle again. And the front line stabilized halfway up the peninsula, which is roughly where it was to start with. Then the war lasted for 2 more years as the two sides engaged in a war of attrition and had negotiations about how exactly the war was going to end, before finally, when Stalin died, a peace deal was arrived at. And right now, the two sides are separated, as they have been for 70 years, by the DMZ, which is the most heavily fortified border in the world. Okay, peace treaties, you might say. Well, why not peace treaties? What about peace treaties? Peace treaties were once common, but are increasingly rare. I think I mentioned this last time. So Tanisha Fazal is the scholar to look at here. Tanisha Fazal has done a bunch of interesting research showing that states are both reluctant to declare war in the first place and reluctant to sign a peace treaty at the end of it. And her logic is because if you acknowledge that you're in a state of war, then you have to abide by the rules of war, or at least you open yourself up to legal liability for obeying the rules of war, which states don't want to incur. And so if you look at 1800 to 2000 and the percentage of wars ended with peace treaties, this is just a figure that I copied from her article. You can see, like, the late 19th century is the heyday of peace treaties. That's when countries fighting international wars were sort of the most legalistic about it. They would declare a war when they started the war, and they would have a peace treaty to end it. And that has been falling off ever since. The first half of the 20th century was a bit less, and the Cold War era became a precipitous fall off, and nobody declared war anymore. The Korean War was not a war. That was a police action. The current war is a special military operation. So states don't like to declare war anymore, and so peace treaties are becoming less common. We'll see if that holds true in the current conflict. Okay, so let's get now to why wars end in terms of the theory that I proposed previously. And I mentioned Geoffrey Blaney, the historian, his sort of one-sentence calculation of this theory, which is wars start when states disagree about relative power. Wars end when states agree about relative power. Here, by the way, is World War I. The end of World War I was, the armistice was negotiated in this rail car, and here's Marshal Foch and some of the other generals involved in that wagon. Hitler then, when he conquered France in 1940, pulled that rail car out of the museum, put it back where it was, and made France sign their capitulation. And then, perhaps to prevent them doing the same thing again, the SS destroyed the rail car, apparently, as the Germans were leaving France. So let's think about how wars provide information about relative power. And let's look at the World War I case. So 1914 was very informative. Right? Both sides, especially the Germans, started the war thinking they're going to win and win quickly, or at least that they had a chance in doing so. Germans had this very ambitious Schlieffen plan for conquering France and essentially knocking France out of the war first, and then they would wheel all their forces to the east and attack Russia and defeat Russia. They thought they had to attack France first because France would mobilize more quickly than Russia, and so they would have to defeat France first. But Russia took a long time to mobilize, and so they could afford to wait to confront Russia until a year or two after they defeated France. Turned out the Schlieffen plan almost succeeded, but it did fail, and so you ended up with a stalemate on the front that we observed, that I've talked about before. So that was disappointing news for the Germans, right? Their hopes were dashed. It was also disappointing for the French. Less famously, they had a plan, Plan 17, to attack into Alsace-Lorraine. France wanted to get back Alsace and Lorraine at that point, which were two provinces that the Germans had taken away from them back in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So the French goal in this whole thing was to get back Alsace and Lorraine, which they eventually did get back, and now if you look at a map of France, you'll see them as part of France. So they attacked into the teeth of the German defenses along the Alsace-Lorraine border and failed. So both sides had offensives that failed. The French offensive failed completely. The Germans came much closer and conquered a lot of territory, but ultimately failed in their strategic objective of knocking the French out of the war. However, in 1915, the Germans turned their attention to the east and actually make a lot of progress against the Russians with their Austro-Hungarian allies. And so things look up for the Germans. They get more optimistic. In 1916, disappointing news for both sides once again. The British have the offensive at the Somme, the Germans have their offensive at Verdun. Both fail miserably with hundreds of thousands of fatalities on each side. And so again, learning lesson, our strategies are failing, our tactics are failing, and war is incredibly costly. So you would think that would produce incentives for negotiation, but apparently not enough. In 1917, Germany knocks Russia out of the war. And this is an enormous victory for the Germans. This enables the Germans to take all of their military forces in the east and reallocate them to the Western Front. So they bring over 40 divisions out of Russia and put them on the Western Front, which is in part why they succeed in those spring offensives that I just talked about. So they have hope, right? We've won, we've defeated one country, now maybe we can defeat France. And indeed, their spring offensive breaks the stalemate, restores maneuver to the battlefield, and looks hopeful. But eventually it peters out, and then the Allies start pushing the Germans back mile after mile after mile, And by 1918, it's clear that the Allies were stronger and would win. And so interestingly, Germany actually, World War I does not end in the same way World War II does. World War II ends with the Russians and the Americans shaking hands at the bridge of Torgau, the Russians conquering Berlin, and Hitler is dead, right? It's absolute, total victory. The Germans, however, in World War I surrender before that happens. But they surrender because they can see it's going to happen. They can look down into the future and realize we're going to lose this. If we keep fighting, the Allies will be in Berlin before the end of the year. So essentially, you do have a case here where eventually, at the very last, the Germans finally capitulate, being able to anticipate that they are going to lose the war. So in this case, you can at least see it seems to obey the rough outlines of the theory, is that the more the Germans learn about the war, eventually they become more pessimistic, and once it becomes clear that they're going to lose, they capitulate. Now we'll see why perhaps it took them especially long to learn in a second. Okay, so that's the balance of power. What about the balance of resolve, right? I mentioned the balance of resolve as being important. So here, a classic case is the United States and Vietnam. Right, the United States lands troops in Vietnam in 1965. Why? We want to preserve the independence of South Vietnam against North Vietnam. North Vietnam is infiltrating rebels, supporting the Viet Cong, threatening South Vietnam. We want to preserve capitalist South Vietnam as a counterweight to communist North Vietnam. This is the Cold War. By 1968, we've got 500,000 troops there fighting the communist guerrillas and North Vietnamese troops along the border. By 1970, it's clear that that's not sustainable for the United States. The domestic opposition to the Vietnam War is so great that even though we haven't lost on the battlefield, we are going to have to get out. No president is going to be able to sustain American forces. And indeed, Richard Nixon comes in 1968, promising to end the war. Like he has a secret peace plan. Not to just withdraw right away, of course, but eventually to end the war. So the two sides eventually, North Vietnam and the United States, settle the conflict at that point and have negotiations in Paris in 1972, culminating in the 1973 Paris Accords. And here's Henry Kissinger and his North Vietnamese counterpart shaking hands after the peace deal that is signed in 1973, which gets the United States out of Vietnam. So this is kind of a paradigmatic case of there's uncertainty about resolve, who's going to last longer. Turns out North Vietnam's going to last longer. The United States, once they realize that, decides to get out. And here we have a deal, an actual peace treaty that formalizes that. North Vietnam, of course, ultimately reneges on the peace deal and attacks South Vietnam 2 years later and conquers it. So this was sometimes called a decent interval or a fig leaf. Everyone knew that was going to happen, but the United States didn't want it to happen while we were still there. So that's war providing information on the balance of resolve. It took 20 years for that to happen in Afghanistan.
I'm sorry if you can finish this. The question is, would you categorize this one as intrastate or intra-state?
Good question.
It takes much longer. The
Yes.
technologically. So I was wondering because I think I also said international relationships, we categorize it as a proxy one. So it's not exactly intrastate, it's not exactly intrastate. So you get one side supporting and Ukraine in some parts, I think it's very reminiscent of asymmetrical warfare. I just had, I've been collecting some questions for you.
Sure. The Vietnam War, of course, how you characterize it was part of the political debate about it at the time, right? The American characterization of it is South Vietnam is a sovereign state. We are helping it defend itself against aggression from the North Vietnamese. From the North Vietnamese perspective, it's Vietnam is a state which is emerging from colonialism, which has not yet fully emerged from colonialism because ex-colonial powers are still involved in the South. That was obviously true when the French were still fighting the war up until 1954 in Dien Bien Phu. The French then left, and the United States took over the role of trying to protect South Vietnam. So certainly up to 54, you would characterize that as the extra-systemic war. Post-1954, it depends upon what your attitude is towards the sovereignty of South Vietnam. If you believe of South Vietnam as itself a sovereign state, then it's an international war, because North and South Vietnam are international states, are both states. I don't know their actual UN status. That would be an interesting thing to look up. But certainly from the North Vietnamese perspective and from the left-wing perspective within the United States, it was a civil war that the United States was intervening in. So that's a matter of debate. Okay. All right, so information in the present war. If you guys follow The Economist here at the Q School of Economics, there's a bright cover here. Two people I know in political science, Hein Goemans, who I went to graduate school with, and Bronislaw Slonchev, another game theorist in international relations, have a piece in The Economist arguing that when expectations converge between the Russians and the Ukrainians, the war will come to an end. And that draws upon their work in this field, and for the same reasons that we've been just discussing. But my question is, when will that be? And what do those expectations really have to look like? And are the expectations really converging yet? Putin has certainly learned a lot since the war began. He learned that his initial views were incorrect about the speed and low cost of success of his military plans. But as we saw in World War I, that was not enough to end the war, right? Learning of the failure in 1914 didn't convince them to quit fighting, even though rationally perhaps it should have. There are persistent sources of uncertainty involved in this war, and I'll just highlight two of them. Number one is international support for Ukraine. All right, how much support is Ukraine going to be getting looking forward? And two big variables here are in the United States, of course. There is the 2024 United States presidential election, and if Trump is elected, he's almost certainly going to reduce support for Ukraine, given that he has announced his intention of doing so and has it in for Ukraine for a variety of reasons. Even if Trump is not elected, if Congress remains Republican in the House, or perhaps flips and becomes entirely Republican, both House and Senate, you might see increased resistance to funding for Ukraine. You're seeing some worrying trends in other countries as well. Poland recently expressed dissatisfaction with Ukrainian grain imports into Poland, lowering the price of grain and reducing the profits of Polish farmers. Slovakia recently had an election in which they elected a populist, anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian party. So it's possible, in fact, it seems fairly likely that international support for Ukraine will gradually decline. And so that's something that has to be factored in, but we don't know how fast and how long things will last. Another fundamental, I think, question is the level of mobilization of the two sides, right? World War I was a total war. World War II was a total war, certainly for the Allies. Interestingly, this is a very large-scale war, but it's not yet a total war, not for the Russians anyway. The Russians are not fully mobilized. They haven't instituted a draft for universal military service. They haven't put the economy on a full war footing. They haven't introduced rationing of food, any of the things that Great Britain did in World War II, for instance. Russia hasn't done any of that because Putin fears antagonizing the domestic population by demanding sacrifices from them on behalf of this war. Of course, Putin also fears losing the war, and so we'll see there's a tension between those two things. But Russia could mobilize more than it already has, and the question is, will it do so? Arguably, Ukraine could mobilize more than it has, and maybe it's in the process of further mobilization. I don't really know the details. But how big is the Ukrainian army? How big could it get? Could it become bigger? If it were bigger, could it be sustained in the field? Right. We saw in World War II, if you look at the size of the battles in World War II, right, one thing I was struck by is that the offensive that the Ukrainians have been directing in the south of Orgiv, when I looked at the list of units that were had been trained by the West to be used in that battle, it amounted to about 30,000 men, which is about 3 divisions in the usual way of counting these things. 3 divisions would have been considered a small force in World War II. It would not have been considered a serious offensive force in that contest, right? The Germans would be launching at least 10 at any significant objective. You want 100,000 people. The first 30,000 are going to be the ones to break through the lines, but by then they're going to be worn out, and then you need another 30 to follow on, and then another 30. So we are still not at the scale of combat that you saw in World War II, even though the style of combat is very reminiscent of World War I. So the armies could get bigger, and the question is, will they, and who will be able to do that? Okay, now, so I told that story about learning in World War I, and how it seemed to take the Germans and the Allies a long time to figure out who was going to win. So maybe that was rational. Maybe there was good reason to think that you could still win if you were Germany right up through late spring of 1918. But it does seem like it took a long time. And Chaim Gomez has an interesting book, cover displayed here, arguing that Germany was actually a slow learner in this regard for domestic political reasons. They were not responding to new information as they should. And it's an interesting argument, which you'll see in the current context made as well. So he divides regimes, political regimes, into 3 types. 1 is authoritarian, 2 is oligarchical, and 3 is democratic. And they're arrayed along a spectrum in terms of how repressive they are and how exclusionary they are. So repressive means how much force is used against the population to keep them in check. The authoritarians are highly repressive, the oligarchs have a medium level of repression, and the democracies have the least amount of repression. And exclusionary means how much of the body politic is basically excluded from political power. So the authoritarians are highly exclusionary. It's representative of only a tiny fraction of the population. So think Saddam Hussein, like these personalistic dictators, right? Very exclusionary. Almost nobody has any influence. Oligarchical or sort of medium exclusionary, typically organized around a class or around, say, the military as an organization, but less so than the authoritarians. And the democratic regimes, are the least exclusionary. They're the ones that have the most participation from the widest sectors of society. Then he makes the interesting, somewhat paradoxical argument. Before I get to that. So in terms of what happens after a war, he argues that dictators and democrats are kind of similar in various ways, perhaps paradoxically. So dictators have very strong repressive capabilities, and there's very little threat to their power. They can crush any opposition. Therefore, if they win a war, that's great. They're happy. But if they lose a war, they still survive, because there's nobody who can touch them domestically. And you see this again with Saddam Hussein after the Gulf War, right? He loses the Gulf War dramatically, but then he crushes every effort to overthrow him and remains in power. Democrats, conversely, operate under the rule of law. So if they win a war, democratic leaders, that's great. But if they lose, that's okay too for them personally. They may retire, they may be kind of unpopular, but they're not in any big trouble. And here's a picture of Winston Churchill in happier days after he won World War II and lost re-election immediately thereafter. And here he is on his country estate with his pooch and his cane and his trademark cigar, enjoying life. He's painting, pursuing gardening, having nice lunches with his wife who he adored. So there's a picture of contentment, right? There's a leader who lost election, but he's still fine. Of course, he won the war, or was on the winning side in the war. So Democratic leaders, if they lose, they just sort of go home, and they're not so bad. So Gomans argues that these factors mean that dictators and Democrats behave the same way in response to war information. That is, if you get good news, you raise your war aims, you become sort of confident that you're going to win, so you start bargaining harder, demanding more. And if you get bad news, you lower your war aims, just like a unitary rational actor. Which makes sense for the dictators because they kind of are a unitary actor, right? There's the dictator. For the Democrats, it's a little bit of a stretch, but you can sort of see the argument, right? Democratic leaders, if the war starts to go badly, they can just settle and then retire with their dog. And so an example here is the Treaty of Paris in 1856, which ended the Crimean War. This is like the classic 19th century negotiating group of people, right? A bunch of guys with medals on their chests and statesmen with mutton chop beards discussing the affairs of state. And the attitude is pragmatic, right? Well, here's the front line, here's where it is now, the war is costly, let's settle it. Here, you get this, I'll get that, and we shake on it, right? Very gentlemanly sort of arrangement. But by people who are basically not in fear of their lives, right? They're pretty secure individuals here. The exception are the oligarchs, according to Gomans. The oligarchs, they lack the strong repressive capabilities, so if they win the war, that's great, they'll be more popular than they were before. But if they lose, they could lose power, because the population could have an uprising against them, and they could be in big, big trouble. So here's Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany before World War I, during World War I as well, who is this sort of poster child for the oligarch whose hold on power is tenuous. And if you lose power and you're one of these oligarchic leaders, it's bad news for you. You might be jailed, you might be exiled, or you might be killed in the ensuing revolution. The Kaiser himself was exiled. He had to flee to Holland wearing women's clothing. So in the oligarchic regime, if you lose the war, your aura of invincibility is punctured. The people who have been excluded, in the German case, the lower classes, the workers, etc., rebel against you. Your regime comes tumbling down, and everything is lost. And this was certainly the fear in Germany in the war, as the war was going on. That if we lose this war, we're done for. The whole order of German society at that point is finished, because the communists are going to take over. Yes?
Can we apply this principle and this story to the Russian Revolution in overthrowing the Tsar Nicholas?
Yes, although he doesn't, and he interestingly codes the Tsar as a dictator, I believe, rather than an oligarch, even though the Tsar and his regime is in many ways more fragile than the German regime. So I think that's a little bit of an inconsistency. And in his case, it's not as crucial part of the story because the Russians are simply defeated militarily. So they don't actually, their information processing isn't the issue here as to why the war lasts, because they're knocked out by force. But I think that's right. And the fear of what happened to the Tsar, I think, was very much on their minds. Okay, so what does this lead to? This leads to a phenomenon that's called gambling for resurrection. Gambling for resurrection. So when oligarchs get good news, they'll raise their war aims, but when oligarchs get bad news, they will not lower their war aims. Why? Because the war has to show a profit. If the war doesn't show a profit, then they're going to be overthrown, or they worry about being overthrown. And therefore, they can't lower their war aims and accept some sort of deal that is short of victory. So they keep fighting, hoping to win. So it's called gambling for resurrection, right? The war's going badly, you're losing, you're losing, you're losing, but you keep rolling the dice, because if you don't win, you're dead. This is Bethmann Hollweg, who was the Chancellor of Germany when the war started. He was famous for a couple of quips, like as the war was just beginning, he said, If we are to roll the iron dice, then may God help us. He also had an estate in what is now Poland, what was then Germany. And there's a famous exchange where he was talking with his gardener, and the gardener was asking him where they should plant some trees. And Bethmann Hollweg said, there's no point planting trees. The Russians are going to be here in 20 years anyway. So he was pessimistic guy. Again, the fear of growing Russian power, which was a big factor in causing World War I. Okay, this also leads to this sort of, well, sort of reinforcing this idea, right? It doesn't matter whether you lose by a little or you lose by a lot for the oligarchs. A huge loss obviously is a problem. You're likely to be overthrown and killed. But even a slight loss might be a problem because, again, it makes you look bad. It sort of provides this information to the domestic population that you are weaker than you claim to be, that perhaps you can be overthrown, and you've got a lot of people out there who want to overthrow you as well. So therefore, any loss at all is unacceptable. You cannot settle on losing terms. Even a slight loss will lead to death in your view. And so you have to fight on in hopes of victory. Right? So this is General Ludendorff, who was basically the military dictator in Germany in the latter years of the war, very much a product of this Prussian Junker landowning class, very much the kind of person whose personal fortunes hung in the balance. Right? If the old order in Germany is overthrown, this guy loses everything. And so his incentive is to keep fighting. That leads to what are called high variance strategies. High variance strategies. So if you're Germany, the war is not going that well, but you've got to win. You can't just settle. So what do? You try high variance strategies. So the variance of a strategy is the range of possible outcomes it could produce. A low variance strategy is going to achieve a certain result with a relatively high degree of certainty. A high variance strategy might lose really big or might win really big. And if you're in this situation where you need to achieve at least some sort of victory, then you're going to be attracted to the high variance strategies because they're the ones that have some chance of offering you that strategic victory that you need. Whereas the prudent strategies that are low variance are not going to give you that chance of spectacular victory. So an example here is submarine warfare. Germany in 1917 launches unrestricted submarine warfare against Great Britain. Why? Because they've got great submarines, for one thing. But they've done very good calculations. The German Navy was very good at their staff work. They did very good calculations of how many tons of shipping the German submarine fleet could sink per month. And very good calculations about how many tons of shipping Great Britain needed to stay alive, literally to stay alive, because they were importing food at the time. And they calculated that if they had the ability to carry out their unrestricted submarine warfare, by 6 months, Britain would be on the brink of starvation, which was true. So they launched this campaign and start sinking exactly the number of ships that they say they're going to sink. And what happens? The United States enters the war. And then you might as well take that plan and throw it in the trash can, because now you've got the industrial capability of the United States of America replacing and doubling and tripling all of the ships that are getting sunk. You've got all the destroyers of the United States of America escorting those convoys halfway across the Atlantic. And so the whole calculation is moot at that point, right? At that point, you're never going to starve Great Britain out of the war, because the United States has entered the war on Britain's side. So it was a great strategy as far as it went, but it was based on a fundamentally flawed premise, namely that you could carry out this campaign without altering the global balance of power, without bringing anybody else into the war, unmolested essentially by additional powers. And they should have known that was not true, given how much conflict had already been back and forth between Germany and the United States up until that point. Basically, Wilson at that point, certainly some of Wilson's advisors, is essentially looking for an excuse to get into the war on the British side. And this just hands it right to them. Okay, so high variance strategies. Now that brings us to the current conflict. And here we have Putin standing or sitting at the end of the long table here. So is Putin one of these oligarchs? Is he somebody who fears the consequences of defeat or even a lack of victory? Goins argues yes, and that may mean that Putin is simply never going to accept anything less than victory here, and he will ignore information that he's losing. So possibly so, in which case he would be resistant to concessions, right, despite information that's showing he was incorrect to begin with, right? I mean, here he's clearly fearful. He doesn't even want to meet at a table within 10 feet of his own subordinates, much less ordinary people outside the Kremlin walls. So he does seem to be afraid of a lot of things here. I think this is actually an interesting debate. I'm not sure where I stand on it. I'm not sure that Putin wouldn't survive even if he lost the war. His repressive apparatus is very powerful, and there's essentially no one who can challenge him. And we saw what happened to Prigozhin. However, there are cracks in the facade, and so who knows? Yes?
Why are you describing Putin as oligarch, not as authoritarian, personalistic leader?
Yeah, that's, I mean, I'm actually somewhat more on the side of thinking he is not personally threatened by a loss in the war. He is one of the, like Saddam Hussein, he could actually survive a loss in the war. So this is, I would say, this is an ongoing debate within the political science community. Some people think he's one of these oligarchic types who's very vulnerable and maybe overthrown. A lot of the Russian emigres I know in the United States think he's going to be overthrown, next month. I think that's wishful thinking, but that's what they're thinking. I think his regime is, it's not strong in the sense that people don't love him, but it's very successfully eliminated all opposition. Yes?
When we speak of victory and loss, what is loss essentially for Russia? As we understand that Russia has attacked Ukrainian territory, has gained some of our territories, unfortunately. And let's say that Ukraine deoccupies those territories really quickly, abruptly. It doesn't mean that Russia loses in this situation, because Russia has lost no territory. Russia has, it lost its men, its military equipment, just material, but it hasn't lost its territories in particular, and it means that the balance is like it has been before the war. So my question is, what is essentially lost for the Russians?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would answer that by saying you're correct that, if the war ended on the current status quo front lines, it would be an enormous victory for Russia because they would have gained a lot of territory. If the Ukrainians succeeded in driving Russia back to the lines of February 2022, then there would be no gains for Russia. And I think combined with the material and human losses, that would be perceived as an utterly humiliating failure on the Russian side. If the Ukrainians actually succeeded in liberating Crimea and the Donbass regions that the Russians held before that, it would be enormously magnified in terms of the humiliation for Russia. So I think there are real chances for loss here for the Russian side. Yeah.
But maybe we should distinguish the perception of the loss in this war from the side of Russian people or some Russian groups of society and personally Putin, because it's very hard to define clearly the loss for Russia in this war. Yes, maybe Putin thinks that acquisition of Crimea, that annexation of Crimea is his greatest achievement in terms of restoration of the Russian Empire, but this may not correlate with the popular opinions.
Mm-hmm. True, and we don't really know one way or the other because there's no real objective public opinion data to be found in Russia anymore. But just in terms of from the abstract, from the outside, for him to have something to point to as a victory, it's fairly straightforward to imagine what he could point to as a victory and what it would not be possible to spin as a victory anymore, I guess is what I would say. Yes?
The first chart meant that point war as something existential and defining a future of Russia and its existence. It really can be a loss for Putin personally because he can lose his power and his popularity maybe, and moreover in the terms of Russian opinion it's also like existence of kind of so in terms of that. And also I have a question. What do you think about the theory of degenerative dictator that belongs to Konstantin Sonnenberg?
Yes. So there's many things in there. Just briefly, because there's a few more slides I want to get to. I think you're right. I think one thing that your question touches on is to what extent Putin thinks that this war is beneficial for his hold on power or not. I think at this point he's riding the tiger. He can't get off, right? I think the question remains, was it a smart thing for him to do to bolster his hold on power to begin with? And personally, I think it wasn't. So I kind of disagree with this was motivated by domestic politics framing or argument in the sense that I think this was an enormous risk on Putin's part and jeopardized his hold on power. Like ex ante, in February of 22 when this decision was made, if I were Putin and I'm thinking, what's the way to make sure that I hold on power for the longest? This war is the least thing I would have picked because it involves all kinds of uncertainties. Who knows what might happen. So I actually am not as keen on that explanation of the war. The Sonin paper, I think there's a lot to it. I think in this case, so the Costa Sonin paper is about autocracies and how they essentially get into this sort of spiral of worse and worse information because they select subordinates who lie to them, basically, because they privilege loyalty over competence, among other things. And so he uses that to explain it. I'm not sure that that's really at stake, maybe. I think that's a general phenomenon. I think Saddam Hussein, maybe you found that. But I think Putin is sort of driving it. I don't think Putin is, I don't think he's being convinced to do something he doesn't want to do or didn't think of doing in the first place. I think people around him were genuinely surprised when he opted for this war. So anyway, I think it's a good paper. I'm not sure it's the cause of the war, but I will come back to that if you want later. Okay, let me continue on here and finish up. Okay, so nuclear weapons. That's a big topic. I don't know if it's been a big topic here in Ukraine. It's been a big topic in the West. Will Putin use nuclear weapons? And my suggestion is that he might very well, if he thought that Ukraine was really succeeding dramatically. So if Ukraine did succeed in this strategy of the offensive that's going on right now, of getting to the Sea of Azov and cutting off the Russians west of that point, and if the Russian position therefore collapsed because they couldn't resupply them adequately over the Kerch Strait Bridge, that would be an enormous collapse for the Russian war effort. And if it then looked as if in the next year the Ukrainians were going to march on Donetsk and Luhansk and successfully retake those territories, I can easily imagine as a last-ditch, high-risk, high-variance strategy, Putin ordering a nuclear strike somewhere in Ukraine. Now, it's possible that that order would not be carried out and that he would be overthrown as a result. There has been interesting tensions surfacing within the Russian military about how nuclear weapons are to be used and what the Russian nuclear doctrine is. I don't think he would simply order, like, as a very first strike, an attack on Kyiv or an attack on Kharkiv or some city where you're going to kill tens of millions, tens of thousands of people in one strike. I think he would probably attack somewhere else, a smaller city or somewhere at a nominally military target as a warning. But I actually am somewhat worried that Putin would actually order a nuclear strike if he perceived himself to be losing that dramatically. Okay, so we've talked about constraints on Putin and Putin's hold on power. What about Zelensky? Does he have any constraints? And I would say at this point he doesn't seem to, but the one sort of warning I would be concerned about is the far-right forces like Azov, right? When they come back from the war, they're going to be heavily armed, they're going to be battle-hardened, And despite a lot of discussion about whether they're not really Nazis anymore, blah, 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 I would guess that people's political views do not become more benevolent after fighting a war. They become harsher. People go to war as normal people and they come back really angry and really violent. That happens widespread. And so I don't think if you go into a war as a pretty neo-Nazi style person, that you come out of that war as a liberal Democrat. I think those tendencies tend to be reinforced rather than the other way around. So if the peace deal does not restore Ukrainian territory, if it is viewed as a failure, as a loss, then I think Zelensky could be in trouble. Especially being Jewish, right? He might be suspect. You could have stab in the back mythology arising, which is of course a staple of Nazi ideology. Anti-Semitism is a core component of Nazism. And so you could have some return to revolutionary activity or terrorism. Here's Zelensky bringing home the Azov-style defenders from Turkey, and everybody's very happy. But I do wonder what will happen in the future if the war is perceived to be a failure. And in that case, perhaps Zelensky has additional incentive to keep fighting rather than negotiate. Okay, changing power in war termination. Should speed up a little bit. So fighting doesn't necessarily resolve the commitment problems. Right? So you don't necessarily have to fight. So in wars motivated by commitment problems, you may have to fight to total victory. There's possible ways to get around that if you can politically change situations so that the power shift doesn't happen. And the most obvious one here, right? Ukraine wants to move towards the West, wants to move towards NATO. That's the big anticipated shift in power, in my view. And a Trump administration might actually prevent that. A Trump administration might actually take the United States out of NATO as a whole, which I think would be disastrous, but it's something that they might do. But that would resolve the power shift all right, but very much to the detriment of Ukraine. So that would be one way that the war might end, but not a good one, in my view. And finally, trust and peace deals, right? So there's been a lot of talk about if you negotiate with Putin, assuming Putin were ever willing to negotiate, how could you expect that he would abide by the peace deal, right? He never would. He's untrustworthy. We know that. So my answer is that's true kind of for individuals, right? This is the wreckage of Prigozhin's plane, right? If you're somebody like Prigozhin, you would be rather foolish to trust Putin. I mean, I can't imagine how Prigozhin and 8 of his deputies got on board a plane within the territory of Russia and didn't think they were going to get killed. I mean, that's just amazing to me. But the key thing to remember is states are much less vulnerable than people. Once Prigozhin stepped on that plane, he was done, right? There was no fighting back. States are not like that. States have armies, and Ukraine can obviously fight back. The key thing is deals last as long as they reflect the balance of power. So if you negotiate a deal, it will last as long as the underlying power balance which corresponded with that deal lasts. But if the power shifts, then the deal has to shift as well. Otherwise, war will result. So this is a picture of the Wheel of Fortune, this famous medieval metaphor symbolizing that you rise and fall, and things going well, but then you are cast down again. So how could power shift? Well, so Russia might attack if Ukraine grows weaker over time, right? If there's a peace deal that's negotiated, but then Ukraine sort of grows weaker over time, Russia could relaunch the war in the future. Much like Azerbaijan recently did when they took control of Nagorno-Karabakh, right? Nagorno-Karabakh, it used to be the Armenians were the stronger side and threatened the Azerbaijanis. Then they sort of languished and the Azerbaijanis took the offensive and finally wiped out Nagorno-Karabakh altogether. On the Ukrainian side, if Russia grew weaker, let's say Putin was overthrown, let's say there was domestic turmoil, then the Ukrainians might decide to restart the war themselves to regain the lost territories. So if power shifts, the war might restart. Okay. Minsk, you probably know this all much better than me, but just to highlight, right, I think part of the problem with the Minsk agreements was that they were trying to stabilize the balance of power. And when you're bargaining over things that influence bargaining power, that's a very difficult task. So Minsk was basically an attempt by the Russians to freeze Ukraine in this inferior position of power and freeze it such that Russia had continuing influence within Ukraine because of the federal system and the role, sort of the veto role of the Eastern republics, et cetera. So the goal was to keep Ukraine weak. That's why Russia liked it. That's why Ukraine didn't like it. Okay. In terms of domestic politics, what's happening, just briefly to wrap up. So the majority still supports aid to Ukraine, but I would say the margin is declining. Right? Who opposes Ukrainian aid now in the United States? Number one, the far left. They've always opposed US imperialism. They point to far-right elements in Ukraine, like the Bandera, sort of people who lionize Bandera, the Azov, Svoboda. The far left, however, in the United States is not very influential. Much more influential is the far right, thanks to Trump. Right? Trump is now, of course, pro-Russia. He has amazingly brought along with him the majority of the Republican Party to also be pro-Russia. That's really the factor that we're confronting here. And here's Trump looking like a beaten dog next to Putin in 2016 or 2018. And then there's a third category, the foreign policy realists. If you've been following these debates, people like John Mearsheimer, Mike Dash, they argue for restraint. They want the United States to not meddle in other countries. And they basically think Russia has a natural right to a sphere of influence. And Ukraine is just too bad. You know, you're next to Russia, so you're part of their sphere of influence. There's nothing that can be done about that. You might as well just get used to it. And we shouldn't go around the world helping people anyway. So that's basically their attitude. They are less influential as sort of academics, but they are becoming essentially the foreign policy intelligentsia for the far right. So all of these ideas are percolating into the far right. And amazingly, to my mind, as somebody who grew up in the 80s, these guys are now making the exact same arguments that the far left used to make. The far left used to make all these arguments about America is an imperialist country and going around the world doing all these bad things. Now you hear that from the Republicans. Now you hear that from the foreign policy realists. Okay, just last weekend, right, we had the shutdown negotiations in Washington where the shutdown was averted by a last-minute move by Kevin McCarthy, the Republican Speaker of the House, Republican leader, who subsequently lost his job because of this. But the $6 billion for Ukraine was removed from funding, despite intense lobbying by various people like the Defense Secretary and the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. They're promising to put a Ukraine funding bill forward later. We'll see what that happens. The problem is it's becoming a more partisan issue, right? The Democrats are in favor of supporting Ukraine, but the Republicans are split. And the split seems to be trending in terms of opposing it. Here's Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a member of Congress. And this is the kind of rhetoric she uses, right? A vote for the spending bill is a vote billions in new blood money for the proxy war in Ukraine, no limits to how many American tax dollars the Biden administration will be able to give to Zelensky. How many Republicans will vote to give Biden a blank check for his proxy war with Russia? So they're trying to convince the American public this is a war, this is Biden's war, it's a proxy war against Russia. Again, the exact same rhetoric that the left used in the 1980s against American intervention in Central America, et cetera, now used on the right to criticize US aid for Ukraine. That's what we're dealing with. Speaking of neo-Nazis, when I went to the Maidan, I saw these great patch displays, and I thought, wow, some of these are really interesting and look kind of Nazi. Like there's a lot of death's heads here. But then there were some I loved, right? There's the Yoda, right? There's Yoda. Okay, so this one is absolutely Nazi. Some of these I don't understand, like who's this guy? Cossacks, okay, it's a Cossack. I assume he's a Cossack too.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And the wolf is cool. There's a bunch of rats over here. I don't know what this rat is doing. He's like stealing something.
It's a symbol. It's like if you're on the rear line, you're kind of trying to avoid the front line war. So you're like a rear line rat.
Oh, okay. So that's like.
It's like joke thing.
But it's a negative thing. Like that's not a good thing to be.
If you're, for example,
If you're on the front line, you wouldn't like that.
middle rank officer, which works in like military command, so you're actually like putting on the effort on the command, but not literally.
Okay. And then I have to say, I love this hedgehog. There's a little hedgehog guy there. And if you think, by the way, that these aren't really Nazi patches, I draw your attention to this, which seem to be fake identity cards, fake Ukraine identity cards, with famous people like Joe Biden, Zelensky, I think Poroshenko is here, also Adolf Hitler. So I don't know who buys a fake Ukrainian identity card with Adolf Hitler's picture on it, but enough people buy it so that somebody is selling it at the Maidan. Anyway, so here's my free business idea. Military patches for liberal foreign tourists, right? You've got the unicorn, which is the gay service people patch. You've got my favorite hedgehog over here. I don't know what he's doing. What does it say?
Find, take, wait, and hide.
Find and hide?
Find, take it, and hide.
Find, take, and hide. Okay. Well, what does that mean? Like take Russian equipment?
From the start of the war, when the invasion started, people like, insurgency or something, Ukrainian farmers and everything, they were
The tractors.
yeah, so it's like individualistic, like you find it.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay. I like that one. And there's this purple squirrel with the anti-tank rocket. I think is fantastic. I love him. I haven't found him like in real life though. Okay. So to wrap up. Pessimistically, I foresee no near-term end to the war. Victory seems to be unlikely by either side. In particular, Ukraine doesn't seem to have the forces necessary to really punch through in the south and get to the Sea of Azov, which is what they've been trying to do all year long. Russia is reluctant to negotiate. It may be that Putin is afraid of being overthrown, maybe not. He probably hopes for a reduction in international support for Ukraine over time. He knows that Russia has a larger domestic arms industry, so if it's a contest between Russia's arms industry and Ukraine's, Russia wins. He may bet on Russian willingness to take casualties, namely his own willingness to take casualties, given that the Russian people have no say in this. And so he's probably going to want to try again in 2025. Ukraine, meanwhile, may be reluctant to negotiate as well. They hope for continued support, continued improvements and increases in Ukrainian military capabilities. Again, a breakthrough to the Sea of Azov would be a huge strategic victory and make Crimea essentially difficult, if not impossible, for the Russians to sustain. And so they may still hope to try again in 2024 to achieve that result, which eluded them this year. So that's that's how I sort of analyze the war at this point. So I would say probably continued conflict in 2024, in 2025, again, barring some big victory by either side. But what you may see at the end of that, if you don't get that victory, is something much like Korea. That is, you get a stalemate, you get a long front line, and some sort of demilitarized zone, and then a long period of competition between Russia and Ukraine to see which side will get stronger. Fortunately, in the case of Korea, South Korea won that enormously. When the Korean War happened in the 50s, North Korea was richer than South Korea. By the 1980s, 90s to today, the South Korean economy is 60, 70 times the North Korean economy. May that happen here? I hope so. We'll see. Meanwhile, I keep looking at the map south of Orkiv and willing the line to go further south than it does. Okay, that's it. Questions? Yes.
Okay. I've got many, but I'll try to ask you just one, which is basically, Bannon Wallace has recently given an interview to BBC, not BBC, Telegram, where he, first of all, he said, this war can be won, Vladimir Putin is failing. That's like one of his quotes. So he believes that the war might end not in an armistice, but an actual win for Ukraine. Secondly, what he says, quote, the average age of the soldiers at the front is over 40. I understand President Zelensky's desire to preserve the young for the future, but the fact is that Russia is mobilizing the whole country by stealth. So just as Britain did in 1999-41, perhaps it's time to reassess the scale of Ukraine's mobilization. It seems to me that some officials in the West really believe that the Ukrainian army can construct this big mobilized group of new Ukrainian soldiers who can, give this decisive kind of push and finally get the Russians away from the south. They actually believe that this can work. What do you think? Why do they hold up to this logic if other experts, and perhaps including you, we can assess that this might not work in this case?
I'm not saying it wouldn't work. Well, maybe I haven't studied this carefully, but so what is the draft policy in Ukraine?
The draft policy is that men.
Complex, so many categories. We cannot say it in one sentence. In your country, it's also overwork.
Well, our country is volunteer, but I mean, I just saw this article about Finland, and Finland has universal military service for men, right? When you're 18 to 22, you're liable to military service. So everybody's in the army.
Mass conscription, probably the same. There are some categories, but still, most likely.
So anyway, I mean, I don't know if the Ukrainians, this is my question to you actually, can the Ukrainian army grow bigger than it is? Are there large reserves of people who could be conscripted into service? Do guns exist to arm them? I mean, if so, you need to be doing that now, right? Because those forces would not be trained until sometime next spring, and so they need to be going to the recruiting centers like today. Did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, small comment. I think taking into consideration that we discussed previously about Democrats and democratic regimes, the way that the leader of the democratic state holds on to his power and wishes to hold on to that power, I feel like the mobilization measures have been really unpopular as of now, as of October, so to say.
In Ukraine.
Growing bigger is much more of a necessity than people volunteer as of now.
Mhm.
I mean, sadly, the sizes of armies are just not compatible. I mean, we still try to grow as much as possible, but I pretty much think that the whole procedure of drafting even more people will not be as popular, and first of all, and second of all, not even possible in some cases as well. So I also have a follow-up question, I guess. I mean, why mention the person holding on to power, so to say, because we still need to ensure that there is some government as well. I can't quite imagine the war or non-kind of war going on without any kind of government in the state. So it's natural that Zelensky, for example, or pretty much anybody else will try to hold on to that power. So there will be more drafting measures. But then what else? I pretty much feel like we talked about this in the beginning, that the interstate conflict state 500 days plus, so to say, and we're beyond that already. And I feel like those talks and negotiations in the political world about the continued talks with regard to Ukraine joining EU, I believe, or some plans of NATO establishing this kind of new format that they've not given us the permission to enter NATO, but perhaps they will give us some guarantees. They should be, I feel like they should be either the final blow to Russia, so they won't be the second World War as happened to Germany when they lost the first World War. They said, let's watch another one. So this is the major concern as of now. It's either we do the final blow, but probably not with manpower, so to say. It won't be possible. I mean, that's kind of subjective, I'm sorry. Yeah, or either we should, this case that you mentioned with Germans and Americans entering the war, when this fleet liberation actually recalled completely, the way that it was a very unexpected variable. I feel like the variable should be brought into as of now. And I don't think that funding will cut it. I don't think that, Republicans will be Republicans and so many regimes. Even democratic states have been quite turning away from this whole conflict. That's natural. They don't want to spend money or something that will go on for years and years. I'm sort of talking to someone.
Yeah, no, I can understand. I don't know. I don't know where I guess all I would say is that, feeding all that into this theory about how wars end, if one doesn't think that there's going to be increases in Ukrainian military power looking forward to 2024, and one doesn't think there are going to be decreases in Russian military power going forward to 2024, then it becomes unclear why Ukraine wants to keep fighting. Because the result would be another year of stalemate without significant movements of the front line. And if one foresees that into the indefinite future, it makes sense to settle now, however painful that might be. So I guess that's my question. Like, what is the theory of victory here? What is the theory by which the Ukrainian military forces will improve significantly so that by spring 2024, their chance of victory, of penetrating the Russian lines, of moving forward in large numbers is greater than it was this year? Did you want to go on this?
We're talking about the first discussion that were lost in Russia. The point is that, for example, it's a subjective thought, like the point of victory for Russia is that Russia can retain Ukraine. I think that in the history of talk about international relations theory, like the main point of fighting the war in Ukraine is to gain it back in the sphere of victory. So not being able to get it back means the loss of Russia. But for Ukraine, so like the wars end when the cost is higher than conducting the war itself. So the point is that Russian objective is too much higher. It's like not so distant, and the Ukrainian objective is so distant from each other, so there's kind of no crossing where the peace agreement could be. My objective being the subjective. So the Ukraine could continue mobilizing and keeping the army kind of trying to sustain the bigger army until like 2026, 2025. So the concept is that we are fighting the war because the cost of the war is still less than not fighting it. And I believe that, I just think that Ukrainian command knows too many things of trying to win this war, not with the conventional, not with the manpower, but more with this technological advance and more Russian youth power coefficient, which was Ukraine's advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably the concept. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I think the big component of it was the hope that Western weapons would flow in and that they would be better than Russian weapons, and that would enable victory. I think that it's true that the Western weapons are better than Russian ones. However, they typically perform within a suite of weapons which is not fully available to the Ukrainians. And so if you have a tank that's all by itself, it's not accompanied, it's not sort of plugged into the kind of network that it would be on the American side, it's just a tank, and you can hit it with a anti-tank weapon and destroy it. So I think in that context, the results have been less than we're hoped for. I think ones where it was as advertised, I would say air defense. I would say the anti-tank weapons, the Javelins. I would say the HIMARS. I think the Storm Shadows and the Scalps have done as advertised, and the ATACMS could also do as advertised. But the hope that American tanks or Leopards or Challengers would produce the kind of armored division that would punch through defenses and get to the Sea of Azov in a week, that's just not going to happen. So I think that's been a problem. Yes?
Yeah, okay. So looking back in time, we can see like many truces being violated. Like the first one, which kind of fit the whole picture of the modern warfare, would be like the Napoleonic Wars, where the first time they expelled Napoleon, he just simply came back and waged on 1 or 2 more wars, and simply the truce didn't work. Then the First World War, the 2 most prominent truces that didn't work would be the one imposed on the Ottomans, where the winning side just carved out their country, and there was a national movement just basically nullified the treaty, and it didn't take place. Also, one which the Ukrainians are more familiar with is the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, where the Germans won the war. They pushed back the White and Bolshevik Russians, and yet simply when Germany just started putting their forces on the Western Front, and when they eventually lost, Bolsheviks just said that, well, Germany is not a thing anymore, so we don't have to deal with them, and we actually never recognized Ukraine wars and any one of those peoples, and well, it doesn't matter to us. So how do we ensure that if we ever achieve a decisive victory over Russia, that it's not going to be ground for revenge? They are just going to go straight up and say, well, this treaty doesn't mean anything, and it's just going to do us what we want.
Sure.
What can we do to ensure that this doesn't happen?
You can be armed to the teeth forever.
And what if we...
I think like one of the crucial things for Ukraine is a domestic arms industry. You need a domestic arms industry to produce all of this stuff. And it's got to be world class, and it's got to be as soon as possible. So the big ticket items like tanks, armored personnel carriers, things like that, but also the more specialized electronic heavy things, the missiles, the long-range cruise missiles, the anti-tank rockets. You need to be producing all this stuff in Western Ukraine, right? Lviv needs to be a hub of arms manufacturing on a global scale. That's the only way that's going to work.
Yeah, but also Russia has like much larger capabilities to that.
You could make it a problem. You could make it an issue such that they would not think that they could just, that if you didn't have support, you would be done for, right? If you could build all this stuff in-house, it would at least be a fair fight. And I think, well, another thing I think Ukraine needs to hope for, it's more like a hope rather than a strategy, is that if you do achieve a resounding victory, that Putin is finished, and that his successor thinks that was a huge mistake, we're not going to do that again. So again, lessons learned, it may not be the leader himself who learns the lesson, or he may not be willing to acknowledge that he's learned the lesson, but his successors may learn the lesson. There's an interesting body of political science research by a woman named Sarah Kroko, who looks at leader culpability for starting wars. And she finds that the leaders who start the wars and who are viewed as culpable are more reluctant to negotiate and are more likely to be punished for failure in the war. But if you're a successor leader who comes along and then ends the war, even if you end it on compromise or slightly losing terms, you are not punished by the audience because you can blame it on the predecessor. And so in that sense, states may learn even if the individuals don't. And I think that might happen here. If Putin's successor realizes, which is hard to avoid, that this is a catastrophic mistake, even if it succeeds to some small extent, I think that will be helpful. But yeah, I think a domestic arms industry for Ukraine is very, very important here. Yes?
If Trump is re-elected, is there a chance he can moderate his stance on support to Ukraine under the pressure of some more moderate Republicans or more state-ranging Republicans? There are still some, and so in general, or he has one more on the far side?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, Trump was anti-Ukrainian from the beginning, but his hand was forced, and pro-Russian, but his hand was forced in the early days by Republican leaders who were still anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, who wanted to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons before the war broke out, of course, when Trump was in his first term. My sense is that Trump is further radicalized and further uninterested in being constrained. And so if he comes back in, he's more likely, I would say, to simply cut off aid. And the unfortunate aspect, well, Congress could try to override that and pass aid that has to be distributed against the president's will, but the president has a lot of discretion in foreign policy. So they can do a lot. So I don't think there's much of a silver lining if Trump gets elected. Yes?
If we look at the during the wonders of the realistic theory or Russian theory, can we say that possible nuclear attacks from the Russian side to Ukraine can it be beneficial for breaking stalemates?
Would it be beneficial for breaking stalemates? Oh.
Despite all this collateral damage.
Beneficial for who?
Beneficial for the victory
Of Ukraine?
Yeah, because in this case, they took get to the territories and to
Okay. Yeah, so this is an interesting argument. And this plays into the argument of whether Putin would rationally use nuclear weapons. One argument not to do so would be that this would galvanize further international support for Ukraine. If you break the nuclear taboo, nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945. They were used by America. It's a staple of Russian propaganda that America is an evil country because they use nuclear weapons. For Ukraine, for Russia to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, then would be to place it on the same level as America and to violate this 70-year taboo against using them. What would China's reaction be? What would the rest of the world's reaction be? It would be very hard, I think, to support Russia. I think it would lead to a lot more support for Ukraine, a whole new second wave of support for Ukraine, possibly. I don't know, of course, not being privy, what the American strategic response would be. I think the chance that we would use nuclear weapons is zero. There is some chance, and I believe they have threatened covertly, that we would use conventional force at that point, that we might actually use NATO forces. And the thing the Russians have to fear is if we decide the Russians are completely crazy with the nuclear weapons, we have first strike options. We could literally attack the Russian nuclear forces with an all-out first strike. And some people think that would actually work. Personally, I think that would be insanely risky. But the United States has spent the past 30 years after the Cold War continuing to refine its first strike capabilities against Russian nuclear weapons. And the Russians are very well aware of that. So, and the Russian official military doctrine is nuclear weapons are only to be used if the existence of the state is in danger. And of course, Putin says it's in danger, but nobody believes that. And the Russian military will not believe that. So I think that's another factor to weigh into it. Maybe one more question. I think we're past 8 o'clock.
If somebody wants to ask a question, we'll pass it, because I want to comment on those previous questions. So perhaps we'll pass it to someone else.
Any other last sort of new questions? Yes.
In case of Trump with the next presidential elections, how do you assess the possibility of adjustment to his approach toward the Ukraine under the influence of maybe some state agencies, militaries, National Security Council? We already had the case that Trump is more pro-Russian, but he was, but his national security aide was Bolton, which is in public rhetoric is mostly pro-Ukrainian in this place. How do you assess the possibility of adjustment to this approach under the influence of state bureaucracy?
I think that, again, Trump is going to be less constrained than he was before. I think in the previous administrations, he relied on people like Bolton because they were already prominent on Fox News. They were already had this hawkish reputation, tough guy image. That's what he wants. But he doesn't actually want tough guy policy. He wants restraint. But there's a whole crowd of younger people now who are singing the same restraint song that he can choose from. They don't have the kind of stature that Bolton had or previous experience, but my guess is he goes with somebody like that. He looks long and hard and finds somebody who agrees with him on these policies. So I kind of think that's probably more likely. Maybe last question?
Yeah, so we talked about this way of using game theory related to wars. My question is, I feel like there is this kind of concept that states usually can negotiate and get goal as well for some things. The person here already mentioned that the aims of Russia and Ukraine in this war are extremely different, and this is exactly why it's so hard to negotiate. There is nobody who would do the concession or no, or do otherwise. But I think my question is there any way to utilize the strategy of how's it called, like enhancing or making the bid table bigger? So to put even more. If we can, for example, offer something else to Russia, maybe we'll just go away. I'm laughing at this, but seriously, is there a way of doing this the other way around, not exactly the military type of head-on?
Yes, no, this is what they should be teaching you at the Kyiv School of Economics, right? This is like the classic business school approach. You make the pie bigger, right? Instead of focusing on where you cut it. You try to make the pie bigger, you grow the pie, so everyone is happy. It's very difficult to grow the pie in contexts like this. It's hard to see. The issues are so opposed and so strongly felt that, I mean, what could you offer to the Russians to make them happier? Like, anything would, like, get out of our territory and we'll give you a favorable tariff deal, right? That would not be enough of an incentive. So I think that works in cases where you have multiple issues at stake, they're relatively equally valued, you can add a new one to the pot and maybe that will make things better. But here you've got very negatively correlated interests over very strongly felt issues. Where's that border going to be drawn? And so it's hard to imagine just adding an issue to the pot in order to get to yes. Making the pot bigger is very hard. Okay, it's after 8, I will let you all go, so feel no constraint to remain. It's polite to leave, but if you have more questions, I'll stay and answer whatever questions you have. So this is the official conclusion, but I'll stick around in case you have any further thoughts or questions.